Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Perfect Beer Talk Season 2. Today, I have a very unique guest, Max Leveau. In our webinar series, Perfect Beer Talks, we cover everything related to beer, technology, and sustainability. These three concepts are much more related than you think. You can have a look at the pubinno.com for our past episodes and highlights. Our honorable guest, Max Leveau, is the co-founder and CEO of the Forward Fooding, a collaborative platform for the food industry. Max, I read about you and have known you for your work. You have done great things. You made a fantastic journey starting out from the society general, then Google to forward fooding. I also experienced with quite different career path, even being a basketball coach at one point. Believe me, if you don't like me, I'm sure our audience is also as curious as I am. So, how did you cross paths with the food tech? Can you tell us about yourself for our listeners?
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me. A bit of a background, as you mentioned. Originally, I started working my career in tech. So I was working at Google for a few years. But as a French person, I'm actually based in Italy. But our company Forward Fooding is registered in the UK, with the team being split between London, Barcelona, and Rome, where I based myself with another team member. But my background was in tech. Spent a few years at Google, but always had a big interest in food and sustainability as well. So like food tech sort of like came naturally as a sector of interest. But before really looking into food tech, was something that I looked into back in my days. But I used to live in London before moving to Italy for many years. And with a friend of mine working in finance, we started looking into the crowdfunding sector, and in particular, like equity crowdfunding sector. So how basically you use different platforms to invest in startups. Now, I found that was extremely exciting, and that was kind of like the very early days. I'm talking about like 2013. These were the very early days of equity crowdfunding in the UK. So we studied the opportunity of launching a platform. We didn't do it at the end for many reasons, but I kept kind of like following that sector, and then I stumbled across a project called Crowdfooding back in late 2016, and this is where I met my now co-founder Alessio Dantino back in London, and I started working with him on this project, which was a crowdfunding platform for food and drinks and food tech startups, essentially. We failed miserably after a few months. The market was not ready. Probably we were not ready either. And basically, we pivoted our model to create what is now forward fooding. Main reason being that along the way and along our journey, we actually met a lot of like food corporates, a lot of startups as well, in food tech and in more kind of like traditional food as well. And they really needed to understand that side better. And this is where we identified an opportunity to launch the model that we have today, where our ultimate goal is really to connect food corporations, investors, and food tech startups to help scaling innovation.
Thanks, Max, for walking us through your story. Now, if you allow me, I want to dig down a little bit more with your deep experience. I believe you are the guy for this question. We are well aware that you value the food tech ecosystem, and with forward fooding, you have the chance to closely observe thousands of startups and investors. Max, can you mention the food tech data navigator? What is the most meaningful insight from your eyes? What is the approach of investors? What do you think about the effects of the recession on the sector?
Sure. So basically, to come back as well, maybe to give some context on forward fooding, we define ourselves as a collaborative platform, meaning our main goal is to enable connections between startups, corporates, investors, and other stakeholders. But how we concretely do that, first off, is doing consulting and research work and startup scouting work for corporate clients of the food industry. So we work with companies in the likes of Cargill, General Mills, Nestle, Danone, and a few others, helping their open innovation or R&D teams to understand the sector and then matching them with startups. But to do that piece of work, as you mentioned, we have, as a second part of our business model, we have this data platform called the Food Tech Data Navigator, which is essentially a Crunchbase for food tech. And the idea with that platform is that we use it to do our research and scouting work, but our clients, they can actually buy into the tool via a monthly subscription and access to a global database of startups that now counts about 8,000 companies. So that platform, when we launched it, was the first goal was really to monitor and map out the ecosystem, so not only of startups, but also of all the stakeholders around them, so investors of any kind, from business angels to institutional investors, to accelerators, corporate organizations investing in the sector, and all the kind of like ecosystem enablers. So we launched it in 2019, but we started monitoring that space since we started forward footing in 17, basically. And the database has been growing massively. Basically, when we look at the evolution in that sector, I think what we could consider the year zero of food tech would be around 2010, when we saw like the first companies emerging. But like the true growth of that sector is actually starting in 2016. When we started that database, we had about 1,300 startups. So in 2016, for like a total of about 6 billion in funding over time. Where now, if we look at the data, we have more than 8,000 companies, like 5 years later, with like 54 billion in funding in 2021. So basically, the sector is growing like in triple car, kind of like digits. Investors as well, like the landscape of investors is changing massively in the sense that there was this kind of hype at the beginning of the sector with a lot of investors going into food delivery. That was kind of like the first wave of food tech. Now, after food delivery, all investors are now going into alternative protein, which would be kind of like the second wave of investment. And these two waves, they sort of like contributed to raising awareness about food tech. But food tech encompasses a lot more, like a lot more. We need to take it, and we call it agri-food tech more than food tech, but you need to look at it in a food supply chain perspective, from AgTech in precision agriculture, biofertilizers, technologies, all the way down to alternative protein, functional ingredients, novel ingredients, anything around food and food waste and surplus optimization, anything around food delivery, of course, but anything around food safety, anything around all the form of like alternative processing, etc. And the investor
all the future of food, huh?
Exactly, but you need to look at the whole supply chain basically. But the investor landscape is changing in the sense that when I mentioned these two ways, if we look at the numbers, like 60% of all investments to date went into like 13% of the ecosystem in terms of like number of companies only. So everything went, and when I say 60%, I'm referring to food delivery and alternative protein. Now we see a lot more like investors are specialized in that sector. That was not the case 5 years ago, but now we see a lot more VCs specialized in alternative protein, specialized in food tech in general. So they have kind of like a knowledge about the sector and a broader view about where they should invest in and what are the solutions that are creating an impact, basically. So that's changing the approach in terms of investment now. So we're looking into the food sector. Now, basically, with the recent events, I think we've seen kind of like a shift happening as well, in the sense that 2022 has been a tough year for everyone, also for the food tech sector. Definitely, we're not going to reach the same levels of investment compared to last year. There will be less capital invested, lower valuations, and some subsectors of food tech will be struggling in particular, like especially the ones that have like very high capex. Thinking of vertical farming, for example, food delivery. So there would be like a kind of like a big switch happening from what we think is the initial hype, to a broader scope of solutions to better our food system, basically.
Thanks you so much for sharing, Max. I'm sure we have some young audience tonight with us inspired by this. My following is actually for both of them, and I believe as the younger generations join the workforce more and more, we will start to see a huge cultural shift in how we do business, especially for the startup ecosystem. I'm curious about your take on it. How do you interpret the entrepreneur mindset of the new generation? Is the younger generation making up majority of entrepreneurship? If so, what do you think is the investor's perspective on this issue?
Well, I think if we look at the whole sector, there was definitely, I think, a majority of like younger people launching companies. especially on like on deep tech side of things when you have like PhD students launching their own company. But probably it might be a bit less true in food tech compared to other sectors like fintech, for example, or AgTech or EdTech. I think it's just my gut feeling here. I mean, there's no data to back this up, but in our interactions, like we interact with like hundreds of entrepreneurs, every month, and it's actually quite a mixed crowd. We actually see quite a few people moving from the industry, from the food and drink industry, with a certain number of years of experience, actually moving into startups. And as a matter of fact, I think food tech is a bit older to that perspective. But again, this is just my gut feeling, in the sense that we not only interact with entrepreneurs that are in their 20s or in their 30s, but we also interact with entrepreneurs with a lot more years of experience. That's my first feeling here. Then I don't think younger generation, older generations, it's an issue for investors per se. I think investors, all investors basically, they are backing companies for the people that are behind them, whether they old or young. I think what matters to investors, and one of the first things they're looking at, is the balance within the team, right? So they need to be, of course, within the right mindsets, but they need to have like the right skills balance as well. So for investors in general to back a company, they need to find the right balance in terms of like, okay, is in the founding team, in terms of like scientific or tech background, needs to be matched with proper business experience, and the right mindset in general. So I don't think there's an issue in particular for investors when it comes to like younger versus older generation. It's just about finding the right balance in the funding team.
Yeah, I believe that we are going through a really exciting future with them. Last month, I was in Lisbon for the Europe hottest food tech startups ceremony. Pubinno was one of the 5 finalists.
Yeah.
And Micro Harvest won the best food tech startup in Europe. They are doing very interesting job. Right now, I'm in Tokyo in a food tech event. For example, the most impressed presentation here is a traditional tea. They are spreading a traditional tea to all around the world. So the spectrum in food tech area is so big, and I'm sure we will see very interesting things in the near future. And as you, by Forward Fooding, you are contributing to ecosystem, really great value. Thanks for it.
Thank you.
So, in your opinion, how should startups adapt to local cultural practices to be successful? What is the importance of it?
I mean, cultural factors in general.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. Like cultural factors, I'm not too sure. I think it's more about mindsets than cultural factor. If I understood well your question, and I think what's happening now in terms of like the current like economic context that we're going through, more than ever, like building a startup company is a roller coaster, right? Emotionally, financially, and in terms of like accepting the risk that you're taking. So I think there's like a kind of like a big hype in terms of like, okay, well, building a startup is cool. That's the thing to do. But I think a lot of entrepreneurs need to realize, a lot of students need to realize that it's a massive handover, in the sense that you need to be ready to actually build your own company. It's not just surfing a hype here. Like you need to be. It's a tough journey. It's a roller coaster. You need to be resilient. You need to be ready to make sacrifices. And I think that's and take like a very lean approach in anything you're doing, in terms of like fail, iterate, fail again until you succeed, basically. So that's the right mindset to have.
So Samuel Beckett is the keyword, huh?
Yeah.
Roller coaster, try again and fail better. Actually, I totally agree with you. CB Insight. CB Insight shows the Pubinno, one of the 7 startups in the world which will disrupt the bar industry. In 2018, and 19 in a row. They show us one of the best startups. And now, when you look at that list, do you know how many of them alive?
Yeah,
Only
that's
two.
a good thing. Good question. I don't know exactly. I think the stat is like nine companies out of 10 actually survive in average. So only two out of how many?
Only two. Only two of them. Yeah, we are talking about the best.
Yeah,
So this is a startup ladder.
yeah.
And for example, Alchemist, the most known enterprise accelerator in Silicon Valley, was our first investor. When I went to Valley and in the first lesson, first presentation, Max. Three people face occurred on the screen, then a text, RIP, rest in peace. Then it says, these guys from the alumni of Alchemist. Then Ravi, the president of Alchemist, come and say the first sentence, don't be suicide yourself. Okay, this journey is so long. Keep on your, because in Silicon Valley is so, so popular for the founders suicides. So it helps me. Yeah, it's very normal. Young generations need to understand before jumping into this ocean. This is a roller coaster, as you say.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's make a little bit funnier. We have a small game, Max. I will ask you quick questions. These or these questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Go
Let's keep on. All right. Paris or Rome?
Paris or Rome? You put me in a difficult situation. I'm French, based in Rome for my girlfriend. So, okay, I'll be diplomatic here. I'll say Rome. Don't tell anyone.
Okay. French cuisine or Italian cuisine?
Again, no, another tough situation here. I mean, deep in my heart, French cuisine. In the day-to-day, I really like Italian cuisine though, because the fight is really centered on the product. And it's very simple for like the day-to-day kind of like cuisine, I'd say. I'd say Italian cuisine, but to behave and then I'll go back to your first question. I say Paris then.
Okay, this is much more easy. Messi or Kylian Mbappe?
Mbappe.
Corporate or startup?
What's the first one, sorry?
Corporate or startup?
Well, startups.
Croissant or Panzerotti?
Croissant.
All right.
That one, no doubt. Croissant all the way.
The last one comes from the beer side. Peroni or Kronenbourg?
That's a tough one. I'm more like an IPA guy, so none of them.
All right. Thanks for joining the game. So my following question is also about your projections, like the previous one. What excites you most about the coming developments in AgTech, and what innovations can we expect in the future that will surprise us immensely? I'm curious about your thoughts and expectations on the future of the beverage industry specifically.
Sure. So AgTech basically, well, there's definitely a lot happening in the AgTech side of things. So the way we define AgTech, we are like different, or each of the verticals that we have in food tech, basically, we have different sub-verticals. So from like, precision farming and like farm management, like pure like software and sensor solution, where there's definitely a lot happening, but it's more like it's probably one of the oldest subsector within food tech, right? Then you have everything around, insect farming, anything around vertical farming, of course, anything around farming automation, autonomous tractor and all of that, and robotics in farming. But there's one area that I think is particularly interesting is what we call ag biotech. So it's anything around basically biofertilizers, bio crop protection solutions, anything around like seed genetics, so this kind of like this whole thing about GMOs basically, and this perceived as bad when actually they can actually solve quite a lot of solutions for our food system basically. And what I find particularly interesting about AgBiotech is that basically you have companies that are working on like re-engineering plants to kind of like enhance the content of like the protein content. So there's lots of interaction between what you do on the field and how you basically leverage this to make better alternative protein products. For example, thinking of a company called Mulek, for example, they basically do what we call molecular farming. And what's molecular farming is basically what they do. These companies basically they allow to include kind of like animal proteins, gene DNA codes inside the genome of like a main plant used in foods. And basically each protein is like selected to and add value in terms of like targeted functionalities like taste, texture, and nutritional values. But that happens in the lab before actually, planting the seeds basically. Now I find that fascinating. We see a lot of like innovation in that and a lot of traction, in that area. And another piece of that's quite interesting is like farming automation. So basically farming robots that are becoming, more precise, always more smarter as well. And I think we see a lot more of that.
I feel so excited to witness the future. It seems like there are so many players working for the creating better world. For example, in Pubinno, we are creating the perfect beer experience by standardizing the quality, unlike manual tabs, which we have no control over. Also, with the real-time data, it gives the bar owner information about the sales, especially on quality for the decision making. I'm excited to combine our technologies in the future with the production processes as well. So there is also the restaurant aspect. In my opinion, the end consumer process is also as important as the production process. Your podcast, Forward Fooding, mentions the future of restaurant is still a somewhat traditional business, and most of its processes are still same as they were 20 years ago, which can create operational, economic, or quality standardization problems. So not everyone adapts to technology immediately. At this point, what do you think about the future of restaurant, Max? Do you have any icebreaker suggestions for our listeners?
Well, I think future restaurants, I think I do believe that we need to keep also, the traditional aspect in the sense that I'm kind of like not fully for like the full digital experience, like, serving robots and all this stuff. I think, people go to restaurants as well for the human experience. The true innovation in the restaurant space, at least right now, what's happening in the short term is more on the back end side of things. So basically how restaurants need to digitize the whole kind of like operations in the back end to make their operations more efficient. So thinking of like platforms for them to order foods with their suppliers. So lots of solutions out there in terms of like, because that was kind of like a process that historically has been quite manual. Now you get lots of players out there, but basically help restaurant managers to manage their operation when it comes to like food ordering. So basically ordering directly from their suppliers, centralize everything into single platforms, and basically use the same tool to make their operations more efficient. That could be integrated with like POS systems, for example. So this is something that the consumer, the customers would not actually, see, but it is like where the true kind of like innovation is at the moment. Then thinking of the back end, this is more kind of like a long-term vision. A lot of like tasks might be actually automated in the kitchen, So you see robotics companies emerging quite a lot and a lot of like capital being invested. Although right now they kind of like part of like these sectors that are going through a rough time because they're quite capex intensive and the reality of the market makes it more difficult. But I think long term we're going to see more automation, especially because post-COVID restaurants are really struggling to hire staff, and that's something that really kind of like is not, I think, going to improve anytime soon. I think restaurateurs are really have issues on that. And then other area that's kind of like has been highlighted by even more by COVID as well as like how do they embrace food delivery as a revenue stream, right? And you see like the emergence of like more dark kitchens, to be fair, I don't know how. I mean, it's not going to be that easy for them to survive. But I think, of course, like all restaurants, they need to embrace delivery. I think to survive at this stage, it's also a good opportunity for them, I believe. But one of the solutions as well when it comes to kind of like optimizing the operations in the back end are all these platforms that basically allow restaurants to kind of like manage all the different delivery platforms in one single tool instead of having, like 7 iPads, one for Glovo, one for Deliveroo, one for Just Eat. They basically centralize all the operations to make the whole process more digital. So this is how we see it right now. It's like not particularly exciting, but this is really what restaurants needs to work on, and where we see the most kind of like capital being invested in the most traction right now is like how basically tech can support restaurants in making their operations more efficient.
I totally agree with you. Something should be staying traditional. For example, in every interview, people ask me, does Pubinno replacing the bartenders? I said always, beer is a social drink, okay? And we are not replacing bartenders. We are just helping them to create more time for their art. Okay, their art is talking to customers, making the cocktails, put the glass while pouring the beer, do the other stuff. That's it. Bartender always will be there. And because bar always will be there. As you say, something should be traditional because this is a people business. This is not a business about the packaging, about the delivery. This is a restaurant. This is pub comes from the public house. So that's the summary, I think. I totally agree with you. All right, let's go to the next question. I wonder, how did you recognize the need for a collaboration platform for the food and beverage industry between startups and investors? And what are your experiences in getting corporates and traditional companies to engage with innovation?
Well, it's kind of like a mix, sort of like it really depends on which companies you're working with. So how do we recognize the need? As I mentioned earlier, it was really born in the back of our first kind of like failing business, like the crowdfunding platform. Like as we worked on like building that company, we actually grew quite a big network of like F&B corporates who got interested into food innovation and food tech, which was very early in 2016. Was almost kind of just a buzzword, but yet organizations were really kind of like interested in learning more. And as we were in London back then, we grew our network there, and they saw us as kind of like a port of entry to actually learn more about the sector. And this is how we started doing consulting for these clients. We're trying to help our network of startups as well. So like it was kind of like born from our network, and like how we got approached there. And then the model varied over the years and to what it is now. And as we grew, we started like we saw a need as well in terms of like building like connections on the ground, which is what we also built like our food innovation hubs in London, then in Barcelona and Milan, where part of this team is based alongside a number of food tech companies. And every quarter, more or less, we do organize like these food tech meetups where we bring together like startups, investors, and corporates to meet and talk about different topics, like different verticals. Last 2 weeks ago, for example, we were in Barcelona for an event on food and biotechnology, where we invited 5 companies to pitch their solutions. Had a fireside chat with like a regulation expert as well, and I had quite a few corporate and investors in the room. So these kind of like physical meetups are quite interesting to support and help the ecosystem. Then your question about the how do corporates and startups collaborate and engage when it comes to like innovation. It really depends from one company to the other, to be fair. Basically, what is needed on the corporate side to make it work, they need first off to have like the buy-in from their top management, and they need to have a team in place to actually make concrete initiatives happen. We do work with some corporate clients that are extremely new about that whole sector and the whole kind of like open innovation journey, and they come to us and say, okay, well, tell us what the agri-food tech sector is all about. And then we'll start by explaining to them how, looking at the whole supply chain, talk about the different verticals, the different sub-verticals, the market trends, the market dynamics behind them. And our role is basically to help them kind of like identify technological areas where they could focus on, and then deep dive further into these topics, which could be, fungi fermentation, which could be supply chain technology innovation, food waste innovation, whatever it is about. But our role is basically to help them pinpoint these areas, and this is why we work with R&D teams or open innovation teams mostly, and then get them to come back to us with a specific brief in terms of like how they want to engage. Okay, we want to do pilots with a company doing like a plant-based protein, or we do want to pilot with companies leveraging blockchain to see how we can implement it into our whole kind of like supply chain traceability system. This is where we go and scout companies and that they could engage with, and then manage the relationship between the two. But basically, to get to that point, you need to help the customers to get to that point, and that's kind of like a journey which could be either very long or could be very fast. And it's usually very fast or fairly fast is these clients have buy-in from the top management, they have the budget, and they have the team in place to actually make things happen quickly. And I think this is quite key to really create an impact. This is how we're measuring impact ourselves. Is how many of these collaborations do we make happen, and how far do they go, basically.
Max, thanks for your sharing your stories and insight again. Before moving on to net zero, I think the most important topic nowadays, it's time for our second game. Now, I will start a sentence and I'm gonna want you to fill in the blanks.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. My favorite beer is
Brooklyn Lager. It's
Brooklyn
more like
Lager.
it's to study in the US, and that's where I discovered it. And probably not the best beer in the world, but I do have like a emotional attachment.
Is it IPA?
Yeah.
All right, Brooklyn Lager. I have never tried that. The most surprising technological development of this year is.
Good question. I think I could mention quite a few for sure, but I'll mention like this molecular farming, as mentioned before. It's not specifically new, from this year. It's a fairly kind of like recent area, and we're going to see a lot more of that.
XXX wins the World Cup.
France.
And the last one. My favorite motto is.
Tough one again. Let me think through that. My favorite motto, no, if it's my favorite, one of my favorites is like better to ask, for forgiveness and permission. In the sense that, we in our team and in general, we really about, sort of like can-do attitude and, enabling people and, just, and I think it should be kind of like a startup motto in general. Like, I think better to go, try, fail, learn, iterate, and do it again than being too cautious. So that would be one.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your answers for the game too. Okay. I want to come to sustainability and net zero point. I feel like many companies in the business are missing the sustainability aspect of the industry. Our passion is making sure the next generations of beer lovers also will be able to enjoy their pints as we do. But I feel like both of us and the audience need your take on this. In the Almanac, we found that one of the most surprising features Gen Z is their perspective on companies. This generation is more willing to collaborate with brands than governments. And one of the most important reasons for this is sustainability. It's interesting seeing managers of companies having that responsibility personally, which leads them to step forward as climate leaders. So, do you think governments and brands do their part of climate awareness and action? How can brands take this responsibility and become more sustainable in all of their operations? How can technology help this? Do you have any advice for it?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have
It's a long question.
Yeah. I'll try to make it short on top of my head, but I think they definitely have, a massive role to play, and this is, our role as an organization to help for that, I mean, to step away from everything around, greenwashing and marketing gimmicks to go towards like concrete actions. So they surely don't do enough, but they can do a lot more. But we do see some switch happening as well. If we take our own kind of like perspective and like in terms of like how we've seen our corporate clients engaging with us and with startup companies in general, I think they do realize that they need to embrace food tech innovation, and they need to do it fast. Then how we do it, whether it is via investment, M&A, or pilots or concrete collaborations, whatever it is, there's definitely different ways to do it, but we've seen a switch happening in the recent years, basically, I would say, in the past 2-3 years. So things are changing, and we see that corporate clients more and more, first off, like engaging with startups early on, in opposition to like when we started, forward fooding, basically we would not put companies in touch with our clients if they were less than Series B in terms of like funding, and that this is changing massively now. They're ready to engage early on to see how they can collaborate with these companies, which is a good thing. And the other aspect as well is that they are more and more keen to take concrete actions and look at the whole supply chain and see, okay, well, this part of our process is not efficient. How can we leverage startups to actually fix that issue? Or this part is not efficient, etc. So that kind of like proactive approach in embracing food tech innovation, really from farm to fork, and step away from just saying, the pure marketing gimmick and say, oh, we invested in that company, or we've done a partnership with X company that has nothing concrete. This is slowly but surely, this is definitely changing. So we need to cooperate, to take that approach in terms of like, adapting, taking like a startup kind of like mindset in terms of like trying, do pilots, iterate, fail, etc. So take the startup mindset as well. So it is, and overcome silos internally. So try to becoming more efficient. That's why it's important to have, as I mentioned before, like buy-in from top management and a dedicated team, because this allows you to kind of like step over like the internal silos that this big organization might have, because the decision-making time of corporates is definitely not aligned with the one from startups. But the more structured they are, the better it works, I think. So that's our piece of advice. And then when it comes to governments, they definitely have a massive role to play, especially when it comes to like regulation. Taking one very concrete example is the cell-based meat, so cellular agriculture, like meat grown in labs, for example, which is massively regulated. Currently, it's only authorized in Singapore. Recently, the US has been granting an approval for a specific product. That's very recent. Netherlands making some progress, as well as Israel, but it's very, very slow, especially in Europe, into that front. So if we really want to unlock some opportunities to kind of like make a bigger impact on the climate side of things, like if we take that example of cellular agriculture, this is where governments, have a massive role to play for sure.
Thank you for sharing your wonderful take. We must all take responsibility. And as you know that, for example, in our area, beer production is a water-intensive industry in which water is used in every step of the brewing process. According to SAB Miller's report, from 50 to 150 liter of water is used from farm to glass to produce 1 liter of beer. Averagely, 102 liter of water for 1 liter beer. One of the most effective methods to reduce the resource consumption is reduce the waste. And I'm very proud and happy Pubinno is preventing waste up to 20% per carry. Since the first day of us, we saved more than 500 million liters of the water for our planet. Every drop is very important for the earth, especially nowadays. So, last question, Max. What comes to your mind when you think of beer and sustainability? How would you associate it?
So like in our sector, if you look at the startup ecosystem, like one thing that comes very often, and the first thing that comes to my mind is circular economy. In two angles attached to beer. One thing is like companies that are working on like upcycling like spent grain from the brewing process into different byproducts, which could be like plant protein, for example, which could be other kind of like functional ingredients or biofertilizers. Thinking of companies like yeasty, for example, or a grain like working on making protein from spent grain from the brewing process. And still about circular economy, I think it of the other way around of like companies that are taking like upcycling ingredients like byproducts to actually make beer. And one that is quite often used is actually bread. For example, bread is one of the elements that is the most wasted in the world. And there are quite a few companies actually upcycling bread to brew it and make beer. And one of the biggest player that we know very well is called Toastale. Fair enough as a name, I guess. And they're quite big in the UK, expanding in the US as well. I don't know if you know the brand, but they make pretty good beer from bread, very different types as well.
Thanks a lot, Max. It was great hearing about the exciting developments of food technology and about the future that awaits us. It was a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Pleasure's mine.
And thanks for the audience. Don't forget to follow Pubinno for recent developments in the industry. I hope you enjoyed the webinar as much as we did with the Max today. Please don't forget to check our blog on pubinno.com to see the previous season highlights. Can't wait to see you in the next episode. And see you in the next episode.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
having me. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.